the quiet halls of a hospital, life is supposed to begin. The neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital was a place where the smallest patients fought their hardest battles. Premature babies, some weighing less than a pound, surrounded by machines, nurses, and doctors doing everything they could to keep them alive. And for years, that system worked. Until suddenly, it didn't. In 2015, doctors began noticing something they had never seen before. Babies who had been stable suddenly collapsing. Infants who were improving, dying without warning. At first, it seemed like a tragic coincidence, but the incidents kept happening again and again and again. Doctors began asking a terrifying question. Was something or someone causing it? When investigators started looking at the staffing records, a disturbing pattern appeared. One nurse seemed to be present during nearly every unexplained collapse. Her name was Lucy Letby. A young neonatal nurse described by colleagues as quiet, dedicated, and deeply committed to caring for the most vulnerable patients in the hospital. But behind the hospital walls, suspicion was growing. By 2018, police would launch a massive investigation. By 2023, that nurse would be convicted of murdering 7 infants and attempting to murder 7 more, becoming one of the most notorious killers in modern British history. But even after the verdict, the case didn't end. Because in the years that followed, doctors, statisticians, and legal experts began raising a different possibility. What if the story everyone believed wasn't the full story? What if this case wasn't about a killer hiding in plain sight, but about a catastrophic failure inside a hospital system? Tonight, on Unsaid Case Files, we examine the crimes, the evidence, and the growing controversy surrounding one of the most debated criminal cases in the United Kingdom, the case of Lucy Letby. Before the investigations, before the headlines, before her name became known around the world, Lucy Letby was simply a nurse. She was born on January 4th, 1990, in Hereford, the only child of 2 parents who, by all accounts, were deeply devoted to her. Friends later described her childhood as quiet and stable. She was known as a polite, reserved student who rarely caused trouble. From an early age, Letby told friends she wanted to work with babies. After finishing school, she enrolled at the University of Chester, studying child nursing. During her training, she completed placements at hospitals that specialized in neonatal care, environments where premature infants required constant monitoring and delicate treatment. In 2011, she graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing. The following year, she accepted a job at the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital. For Letby, it was exactly the career she had dreamed of. The neonatal unit cared for some of the hospital's most fragile patients, premature babies, some born weeks or even months before their due date. Many required breathing machines, feeding tubes, and constant supervision from nurses and doctors. Colleagues later described Letby as hardworking and enthusiastic. In hospital newsletters and staff profiles, she spoke openly about her passion for neonatal nursing and her desire to support families during the most difficult moments of their lives. She even participated in fundraising efforts to build a new neonatal unit for the hospital. To most people around her, Lucy Letby appeared exactly what you would expect a neonatal nurse to be: calm, dedicated, and compassionate. But by 2015, something inside the neonatal unit at Countess of Chester Hospital began to change. Babies who had been recovering suddenly collapsed. Infants who had been stable stopped breathing without warning. At first, doctors believed these tragedies were simply part of the harsh reality of neonatal medicine. But the incidents kept happening, and soon, a pattern would emerge that no one working in the unit could ignore. A pattern that would quietly begin to point toward one person: Lucy Letby. In neonatal medicine, tragedy is never far away. The patients inside the neonatal unit at Countess of Chester Hospital were often extremely premature, fragile, and vulnerable to sudden complications. Doctors and nurses were trained for that reality. But in the summer of 2015, something unusual began happening. Within just a few weeks, several babies experienced sudden and catastrophic collapses. Some stopped breathing without warning. Others developed strange symptoms that doctors struggled to explain. And in several cases, the infants died. For a hospital that normally recorded only 2 or 3 neonatal deaths a year, the sudden cluster immediately raised concern. At first, staff believed it was a tragic coincidence. Premature babies can deteriorate quickly, and neonatal medicine is unpredictable. Doctors reviewed the cases, looking for common medical explanations: infections, complications during birth, undetected health problems. But the pattern continued: more collapses, more emergencies, and more grieving families. Consultant neonatologist Stephen Breary, one of the senior doctors overseeing the unit, began taking a closer look at the incidents. He started reviewing medical notes, shift patterns, and timelines of the collapses, and slowly, an uncomfortable question began to form. Was this really just coincidence? When staff schedules were compared with the timing of the incidents, one detail stood out. One nurse appeared to be present during many of the emergencies. Not every one of them, but enough to make doctors uneasy. That nurse was Lucy Letby. At first, even the doctors who noticed the pattern hesitated to speak openly about it. After all, accusing a colleague of harming patients was almost unthinkable. Instead, the hospital began quietly reviewing the deaths internally. But as more babies collapsed in the months that followed, the concern inside the neonatal unit continued to grow. Because whatever was happening inside Countess of Chester Hospital, it didn't appear to be stopping. By late 2015, the atmosphere inside the neonatal unit at Countess of Chester Hospital had changed. Doctors and nurses were no longer dealing with isolated tragedies. They were seeing something they couldn't easily explain. Babies who appeared to be stable, sometimes even improving, were suddenly crashing without warning. Alarms would sound, staff would rush to the incubators, and desperate attempts would begin to save the child. In several cases, the babies died despite aggressive medical intervention. Consultant neonatologists, including Stephen Breary and Ravi Jayaram, began carefully reviewing each incident. They studied patient records, medical charts, staffing schedules, and the more they looked, the more uneasy they became. The collapses seemed unusual. Some babies develop strange symptoms: sudden skin discoloration, unexplained bleeding, or rapid deterioration that doctors struggled to diagnose. In some cases, infants who had been breathing normally suddenly went into cardiac arrest. For experienced neonatal specialists, it didn't match the patterns they normally saw in premature babies. Then there was another troubling detail. When doctors mapped out the timeline of the incidents, they noticed something difficult to ignore. Many of the unexplained collapses happened while one particular nurse was on duty. Again and again, the name appeared in the records: Lucy Letby. At first, the consultants were cautious. Hospitals are busy environments, and nurses often work many shifts. It was entirely possible that the overlap was simply coincidence. But the pattern was unsettling enough that some doctors quietly raised concerns with hospital management. They asked whether Letby should be temporarily removed from the neonatal unit while the incidents were investigated. The response from hospital leadership was cautious. At the time, there was no direct evidence that anyone had deliberately harmed the infants, and accusing a nurse of something so serious required more than suspicion. So for months, the unit continued operating as normal. But inside the hospital, some doctors were becoming increasingly convinced that something was terribly wrong, and they feared that if nothing changed, more babies could die. By early 2016, concern inside the neonatal unit at Countess of Chester Hospital had reached a breaking point. Consultant doctors, including Stephen Breary and Ravi Jayaram, had now reviewed multiple cases of sudden collapses and deaths, and the pattern still appeared to point in one troubling direction. Once again, Lucy Letby had been on duty during many of the incidents. The doctors began raising their concerns more directly with hospital management. They requested meetings. They presented timelines. They showed administrators the growing list of unexplained events. But hospital leaders were hesitant to act. From their perspective, there was still no clear medical proof that the babies had been deliberately harmed, and accusing a nurse without solid evidence could have serious consequences, both legally and professionally. Instead of removing Letby from the unit immediately, the hospital ordered internal reviews of the cases. One of those reviews was conducted with the help of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. Their report identified several problems inside the neonatal unit: staffing shortages, gaps in senior medical coverage, communication issues between doctors and management. But the report did not find clear evidence that a member of staff had intentionally harmed patients. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, tensions were rising. Some doctors felt their warnings were not being taken seriously. Others worried that raising accusations against a colleague could destroy a career if they were wrong. As the debate continued behind closed doors, the incidents on the neonatal unit did not stop. More collapses, more medical emergencies, and for the families of the babies involved, more devastating loss. By the summer of 2016, the situation had become impossible to ignore, and finally, a decision would be made that would change the course of the investigation. Lucy Letby would be removed from the neonatal unit. In June of 2016, after months of growing concern, doctors at the Countess of Chester Hospital pushed hospital management to take action. Consultant neonatologist Stephen Breary formally asked that Lucy Letby be removed from the neonatal unit while the unexplained collapses were investigated. This time, the hospital agreed. Letby was taken off the ward and reassigned to a non-clinical position within the hospital. Instead of caring for patients, she was moved to administrative duties in the patient safety and risk department. Officially, the hospital described the move as temporary. An internal review of the incidents would continue while Letby worked elsewhere. But inside the neonatal unit, something strange began to happen. The sudden collapses stopped. The unexplained emergencies that had shaken the staff for more than a year no longer appeared. For the consultants who had raised concerns, the change felt significant. If the incidents had truly been caused by natural complications, why had they suddenly stopped? But the situation was far from resolved. Behind the scenes, Lucy Letby was fighting back. She filed a formal grievance against the hospital, arguing that she had been unfairly removed from her job without evidence. An internal investigation reviewed the complaint, and in early 2017, hospital leadership made a surprising decision. They ruled in Letby's favor. The hospital concluded that the consultants who had raised concerns had acted without sufficient proof. Executives even apologized to Letby and her parents. Some of the doctors who had pushed for her removal were asked to write letters of apology. But by that point, the consultants had become convinced that something serious had happened inside the neonatal unit. And despite the hospital's decision, they were no longer willing to let the issue rest. So in the spring of 2017, they took their concerns somewhere else, to the police. In April of 2017, senior doctors from the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital made a decision that would transform the situation from an internal dispute into a criminal investigation. After months of frustration with hospital management, the consultants contacted police. They met with officers from Cheshire Constabulary and presented their concerns about the unexplained deaths and collapses inside the neonatal unit. For the detectives listening to the doctors, the allegations were shocking. The possibility that a nurse might be harming newborn babies was almost unimaginable. But the pattern described by the consultants was serious enough to warrant investigation. Police launched a major inquiry known as Operation Hummingbird. Detectives began reviewing medical records, staffing schedules, and patient histories from the neonatal unit. They examined dozens of cases involving infants who had died or suddenly collapsed between 2015 and 2016. One of the first tasks for investigators was to bring in medical experts. Retired pediatrician Dewey Evans was asked to review the clinical notes from the cases under investigation. As Evans studied the records, he began identifying incidents he believed could not be explained by natural medical causes. In some cases, he suggested that babies may have been deliberately harmed. Air injected into the bloodstream, air forced through feeding tubes, or insulin introduced into the baby's systems. As the investigation expanded, police narrowed their focus to a smaller group of cases they believed were the most suspicious. In total, detectives began examining more than 20 incidents involving newborn babies. And once again, one name appeared repeatedly throughout the records: the same nurse who had been present during many of the unexplained collapses. Lucy Letby. By the summer of 2018, investigators believed they had gathered enough evidence to take the next step. Early one morning, police arrived at a quiet home in the city of Chester, and they knocked on the door. In the early morning hours of July 3rd, 2018, detectives from Cheshire Constabulary arrived at a home in Chester, England. Inside the house was Lucy Letby. At that moment, she was still working for the Countess of Chester Hospital, though she had been removed from the neonatal ward 2 years earlier. Police entered the home and arrested her on suspicion of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder involving infants in the neonatal unit. She was taken into custody for questioning, but the arrest was only the beginning. Detectives began conducting detailed searches of Letby's home, looking for anything that might help explain the deaths they had been investigating. During those searches, police discovered several items that would later become central to the prosecution's case. Among them were hundreds of confidential hospital documents. These included patient handover sheets, paperwork used by nurses to track the condition and treatment of babies during their shifts. In total, investigators found more than 250 of these documents inside Letby's home. Some of them related directly to infants who had died or collapsed during the investigation period. Police also discovered handwritten notes. On some of those notes were disturbing phrases written in pen. "I am evil. I killed them on purpose. I don't deserve to live." Investigators would later argue that the notes suggested guilt. But Letby told police the notes reflected her emotional distress after being accused by colleagues and removed from the neonatal unit. She denied harming any babies. During interviews with detectives, she insisted the collapses had been caused by medical complications, not deliberate acts. After several days of questioning, Letby was released on bail while the investigation continued. But behind the scenes, Operation Hummingbird was far from over. Detectives were now examining years of hospital records, and the deeper they looked into the cases, the more serious the allegations against Lucy Letby would become. More than 4 years after her first arrest, the case against Lucy Letby finally reached the courtroom. On October 10th, 2022, the trial began at Manchester Crown Court. Letby faced a series of devastating accusations. Prosecutors alleged that she had murdered 7 infants and attempted to murder several others while working in the neonatal unit at Countess of Chester Hospital between 2015 and 2016. Because of the sensitivity of the case, the babies involved were identified only by letters: baby A, baby B, baby C, and so on. Over the months that followed, the jury heard testimony from parents, doctors, nurses, and medical experts. Prosecutors argued that the deaths were not natural tragedies. Instead, they claimed the babies had been deliberately harmed. In several cases, the prosecution alleged that air had been injected into the baby's bloodstream, a condition known as an air embolism. In other cases, they claimed insulin had been introduced into the baby's systems. The prosecution also presented a chart showing that Letby had been present during many of the unexplained collapses. To them, the pattern was clear. They argued that Lucy Letby had used her position as a neonatal nurse to attack the most vulnerable patients in the hospital. But the defense told a very different story. Letby's lawyers argued that the neonatal unit had been struggling with serious problems: staff shortages, equipment issues, and high-risk premature infants requiring complex care. They said the prosecution had built its case on assumptions rather than direct proof. There was no witness who had seen Letby harm a baby, no video, no clear forensic evidence. The defense argued that the tragedies inside the neonatal unit were the result of systemic problems, not a single individual. For nearly 10 months, the trial continued. Dozens of witnesses took the stand. Thousands of medical records were examined, and the jury listened as two completely different explanations for the same events were presented. Eventually, the case would come down to one question: did the evidence prove that Lucy Letby had murdered the babies, or had something else gone wrong inside the hospital? After nearly 10 months of testimony, arguments, and medical evidence, the trial of Lucy Letby was finally coming to an end. Inside Manchester Crown Court, the jury had listened to one of the most complex medical murder trials in British history. They had heard from grieving parents, consultant doctors from the neonatal unit at Countess of Chester Hospital, police investigators, and expert witnesses who offered competing explanations for how the babies had died. Now the decision rested with 12 jurors. The jury deliberated for more than 3 weeks. One by one, they worked through the charges involving infants identified only as Baby A through Baby Q. On August 18th, 2023, the verdicts were delivered. The jury found Lucy Letby guilty of murdering 7 infants. They also found her guilty of attempting to murder several others. On 2 charges of attempted murder, she was found not guilty. And on several counts, the jury was unable to reach a verdict. For the families of the victims, the verdict brought a sense of justice after years of uncertainty and grief. 3 days later, Letby returned to court for sentencing. The judge described her crimes as a cruel and calculated campaign of child murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, the most severe punishment available under English law. It meant she would never be released from prison. Lucy Letby chose not to attend the sentencing hearing. Instead, the statements from the victims' families were read aloud in the courtroom without her present. For many people, the case seemed closed. A nurse who had betrayed the trust placed in her, convicted and imprisoned. But outside the courtroom, a new debate was already beginning. Because in the months that followed the verdict, some experts began asking a different question. What if the jury had been given the wrong explanation for what happened inside that neonatal unit? After the conviction of Lucy Letby, the case seemed settled. A jury had heard months of evidence at Manchester Crown Court, and the judge had imposed one of the harshest sentences possible under British law. For many families, the verdict brought a sense of closure. But outside the courtroom, the debate about the case was far from over. In the months that followed the trial, a growing number of medical and statistical experts began reviewing the evidence that had been presented to the jury. Some of them focused on the medical explanations used during the trial, particularly the claims that certain infants had died from air embolisms or insulin poisoning. One of the most prominent voices raising concerns was Shu Lee, a neonatologist whose research had been cited during the prosecution's case. Lee later said he believed the study had been misunderstood. In 2025, he helped organize a panel of 14 international medical experts to review the medical records from the cases. After examining the evidence, the panel reached a controversial conclusion. They said they found no clear medical evidence of murder. Instead, they argued that the deaths and collapses could potentially be explained by natural medical complications or problems within the hospital itself, including staffing shortages and delays in treatment. These findings quickly sparked debate across the United Kingdom. Some doctors and legal experts began questioning whether the evidence used during the trial had been interpreted correctly. Others strongly defended the jury's verdict and the conclusions reached by investigators. Today, the case remains under review by the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which has the authority to refer potential miscarriages of justice back to the courts. For now, Lucy Letby remains in prison, convicted of some of the most shocking crimes in modern British history. But the questions surrounding the case have not disappeared, because sometimes, even after a verdict is delivered, the full story is still being uncovered. Cases like this remind us that the truth is not always simple. Inside the neonatal unit at Countess of Chester Hospital, families experienced unimaginable loss. A jury later convicted Lucy Letby of murdering 7 infants and attempting to murder others, crimes that shocked the United Kingdom and the world. But as we've explored tonight, the story surrounding the case continues to evolve. Medical experts, legal analysts, and investigators are still debating the evidence and what really happened inside that hospital. Whether the verdict ultimately stands forever, or whether new evidence changes how history views this case, the impact on the families involved will never disappear. And that's why stories like this matter, because behind every headline is a deeper story, one that deserves to be examined carefully, honestly, and without assumptions. Thank you for listening to Unsaid Case Files. If you found this episode interesting, make sure you follow the podcast so you never miss a case. You can find Unsaid Case Files on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and everywhere podcasts are available. And if you want to help the show grow, the best thing you can do is share the episode, leave a review, and tell someone else about the podcast. Your support helps us continue telling the stories that others overlook, the stories that still have questions, the stories that remain unsaid. Until next time, I'm Johnny Black, and this is Unsaid Case Files.